The autumn wind carried the scent of fresh-baked apples and cinnamon through the narrow streets of Millbrook, but Clara Mitchell couldn't afford to notice. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so deep it had become her constant companion, gnawing at her insides like a wild animal desperate to escape. 3 days had passed since her last real meal, a stale piece of bread she'd found behind Murphy's bakery, already beginning to mold, but still precious enough to save half for later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara pressed her thin frame against the brick wall of Henderson's General Store, watching the steady stream of well-dressed townspeople emerge with their arms full of groceries. Their faces glowed with the kind of contentment that comes from never wondering where the next meal will come from. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the tears in her dress and the hollow look in her dark eyes. The Great Depression had swept through Millbrook like a plague, leaving destruction in its wake, but it seemed to have missed the wealthy side of town entirely. Here, on Maple Street, gas lamps still flickered cheerfully in the evening twilight, and the smell of roasting meat drifted from kitchen windows. Clara didn't belong here. She knew it, and so did everyone who saw her. Her fingers traced the outline of her empty coin purse through the pocket of her worn coat. 2 cents. That was all she had left of the life she'd once known. 2 cents between her and complete destitution. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once owned a dress that cost more than most people in this town made in a month. Now she couldn't afford a loaf of bread. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began the day her father's textile factory burned to the ground, taking with it not just their family fortune, but also her father's will to live. Within 6 months, debt collectors had claimed their mansion, their carriages, their fine furniture, and even her mother's jewelry. Her parents had died within weeks of each other. Her father from a weak heart broken by financial ruin. Her mother from pneumonia that might have been treatable if they'd still had money for proper medical care. Clara had tried to find work, but jobs for women were scarce, especially for someone with soft hands and no practical skills. She'd grown up expecting to marry well and run a household with servants, not scrub floors or work in factories. The few positions she'd managed to secure had been temporary, a week here, a few days there, never enough to establish any real stability. Now, at 23, she wandered the streets with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The boarding house had evicted her 2 weeks ago when she couldn't make rent. Since then, she'd been sleeping in doorways, park benches, and abandoned buildings, always moving to avoid the police who seemed determined to sweep the homeless out of sight. The sound of laughter drew her attention to the large window of Brennan's restaurant across the street. Through the golden lights spilling onto the sidewalk, she could see families gathered around tables laden with food-roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans glistening with bacon fat, and pies cooling on windowsills. Her mouth watered so intensely it actually hurt. That's when she saw him, Thomas. Brennan stood behind the counter of his family's restaurant, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, carefully sliding a golden brown apple pie onto the display rack. Even from across the street, Clara could see the steam rising from the latticed crust, could almost taste the sweet filling that had made Brennan's famous throughout the county. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and strong hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years perfecting his craft. Clara had heard stories about Thomas Brennan. He was 31, unmarried despite the efforts of half the eligible women in town, and devoted to the restaurant his Irish grandfather had built from nothing. People said he was kind but private, generous with food for those who couldn't pay, but careful not to make a show of his charity. They also said he was the best baker in 3 counties, and that his apple pie could make a grown man weep with joy. Watching him work, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a moment of beauty that transcended her immediate suffering. There was artistry in the way he arranged the pies, poetry in the gentle way he dusted flour from his hands. For just an instant, she forgot about her hunger and simply appreciated the grace of someone who took pride in creating something wonderful. Then her stomach cramped again, violently, and the spell was broken. The restaurant would close in an hour. Thomas would lock up, count his receipts, and go home to whatever comfortable life successful businessmen led. The leftover pies would sit in the kitchen overnight, probably to be sold at a discount the next morning, or given to the church for their weekly charity dinner. Clara made a decision that would change everything. She waited until the last customer left and Thomas disappeared into the back kitchen. The front door stood slightly ajar to let in the cool evening air. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden sidewalk as she crossed the street, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in town could hear it. The restaurant smelled like heaven: yeast and butter, cinnamon and vanilla, coffee and fresh bread. The warmth hit her like a physical embrace after weeks of sleeping in the cold. For a moment, she just stood there, drinking in the comfort of it, feeling human again for the first time in longer than she could remember. The pie sat on the counter like a golden treasure, its crust perfectly browned, steam still curling lazily. From the decorative vents, apple and cinnamon scented the air around it so strongly that Clara's knees went weak. She reached out with trembling fingers, barely believing she was actually going to do this. The first bite was transcendent. The buttery crust dissolved on her tongue, followed by the sweet tart explosion of perfectly spiced apples. It was still warm from the oven, and the filling was exactly the right consistency, not too thick, not too thin, with just enough cinnamon to complement the natural sweetness of the fruit. Clara had eaten in the finest restaurants in New York and Boston, but nothing had ever tasted as good as this stolen pie. She ate standing up, using her fingers, not caring about manners or dignity. Each bite brought her closer to tears, not just from the relief of finally having food in her stomach, but from the sheer perfection of it. This wasn't just sustenance. It was craftsmanship, love baked into pastry and fruit. That's my grandmother's recipe. Clara froze, a piece of crust halfway to her mouth. Thomas Brennan stood in the doorway to the kitchen, but he wasn't angry. His green eyes held something else entirely: curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit in distress. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, setting down what remained of the pie. "I'll pay you back. I promise I'll." "When's the last time you ate?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected accusations, threats to call the police, demands for payment she couldn't provide. Instead, he was looking at her with the same careful attention he'd given the pie, as if she were something worth examining closely. "I don't remember," she admitted, the words barely audible. Thomas moved behind the counter with easy familiarity, pulling out a clean plate and cutting a proper slice from another pie. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. "Finish what you started, but do it properly this time." Clara remained frozen, uncertain whether this was kindness or some elaborate form of humiliation. In her experience, charity always came with conditions, and she'd learned to be wary of people who offered help without stating their price up front. "I won't bite," Thomas said, and there was actually a hint of humor in his voice. "I've seen you walking past here for weeks. You always stop and look in the window, but you never come in. I wondered when you'd finally get hungry enough to break the law." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "You were watching me?" "I watch everyone who looks at my food the way you do. It's not often I see someone who appreciates pie before they've even tasted it." He pushed the plate across the counter. "Besides, anybody desperate enough to steal from Brennan's probably needs it more than we do." Clara approached the counter cautiously, as if the plate might disappear if she moved too quickly. The slice was generous, perfectly cut, with a dollop of fresh cream on the side. It looked like something served to paying customers, not table scraps thrown to a beggar. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, still standing. Thomas considered the question seriously. My grandfather used to say that hunger makes thieves of honest people and honest people of thieves. He fed anyone who asked, and some who were too proud to ask. Said it was good business. Hungry people don't buy pies, but fed people remember where they got their first good meal. I'm not usually a thief, Clara said quickly. Before my father died, I lived in the big house on Elm Street. We had servants and carriages and— I know who you are, Thomas interrupted gently. Clara Mitchell, your father owned a textile mill. I heard about the fire, about what happened after. I'm sorry for your loss. The kindness in his voice nearly broke her. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible, to having people look through her as if poverty had erased her from existence. Having someone see her, really see her, and speak her name with respect was almost more than she could bear. Then you know I can't pay you, she said, lifting her chin with what remained of her pride. Did I ask you to? Clara sat down slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady. She'd been standing or walking for so many hours that the simple act of sitting in a real chair felt like luxury. The pie tasted even better on the proper plate, eaten with a fork instead of her fingers, seasoned with dignity instead of desperation. Thomas moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, cleaning up the days work while she ate. He didn't stare at her or make conversation, but she could feel his presence like warmth from a fireplace, not intrusive, just comforting. When she finished the slice, he wordlessly cut another. I can't take any more, Clara protested. I've already taken too much. You've taken one stolen pie and one offered slice. That's hardly enough to bankrupt me. Thomas refilled her water glass from a pitcher. Besides, you're eating it properly now. That makes it a sale, not theft. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I don't have money for— Who said anything about money? Clara looked up at him, confused. Thomas leaned against the counter, studying her with those thoughtful green eyes. You said you lived in the big house on Elm Street. That means you had education, proper upbringing. Can you read and write? Of course. Handle accounts? Keep books? Yes, but cook? Clara hesitated. I can prepare simple meals, but nothing like this. We always had a cook. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. What about serving customers? Being polite even when they're not? I was raised to be courteous in all circumstances, Clara said, though she wondered where this questioning was leading. Good. Because I've been looking for help. Someone who can handle the front of the restaurant while I focus on the baking. The work isn't glamorous, serving customers, cleaning tables, keeping the books, helping with simple food preparation. But it comes with 3 meals a day, a small room above the restaurant, and enough pay to keep you fed and clothed. Clara stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. You're offering me work? I'm offering you a chance to earn what you need instead of stealing it. Though I have to say, you picked the right pie. That apple recipe has been in my family for 3 generations. Why? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I'm a thief. I broke into your restaurant and stole your food. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, wiping down the counter with methodical precision. My grandfather came to this country with nothing but the clothes on his back and a head full of recipes. He was hungry plenty of times before he got established. He used to tell me that the measure of a man isn't what he has when times are good, but what he does when he sees someone worse off than himself. He hung up the towel and met her eyes directly. Besides, you didn't break in. The door was open. And you didn't steal a pie. You were clearly starving and took what you needed to survive. There's a difference between desperation and greed. Clara felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough over the past months. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not good at this kind of work? Then you'll learn. Everyone starts somewhere. Thomas moved to the register and began counting the day's receipts. The room upstairs is small, but it's clean and warm. There's a bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. You can start tomorrow if you want. I don't understand why you're doing this. Thomas looked up from the money he was counting. Maybe I just believe that everyone deserves a second chance. Or maybe I'm tired of running this place alone. Or maybe I think someone who appreciates good pie that much might be worth keeping around. He smiled then, and Clara realized it was the first genuine smile anyone had directed at her in months. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger, more approachable. She found herself smiling back almost involuntarily. "There's one condition," Thomas said, his expression growing serious again. Clara's smile faded. Here it was, the catch she'd been waiting for. No more stealing. From anyone, anywhere, for any reason. If you need something, you ask. If you're hungry, you eat. If you need help, you can come to me. Deal? It was such a reasonable condition, spoken with such gentle firmness, that Clara almost laughed. After everything she'd been through, after all the degradation and desperation, someone was asking her to promise not to steal food she could now earn honestly. "Deal," she whispered. Thomas nodded and returned to his counting. "There's a bathtub upstairs and clean towels in the linen closet. Take your time getting settled. We open at 6 tomorrow morning, but I'll be here at 4 to start the baking. You can begin whenever you're ready." Clara stood slowly, her legs still shaky but stronger than they'd been in weeks. The simple act of eating real food had begun to restore something inside her, not just physical strength, but a sense of possibility she'd thought was lost forever. "Mr. Brennan," she said as she reached the bottom of the stairs that led to the apartment above. "Thomas," he corrected. "If we're going to work together, it might as well be Thomas." "Thomas." She tested the name, finding she liked the sound of it. "Thank you." He looked up from his receipts, and she saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. Not piety, not charity, but something warmer and more complex. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Wait until you've worked here for a week. You might decide stealing pies was easier than earning them." As Clara climbed the narrow stairs to what would be her new home, she realized that for the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. Behind her, she could hear Thomas moving around the kitchen, preparing for the next day's baking. The sounds were domestic, comforting: the rustle of flour sacks, the gentle clink of mixing bowls, the soft closing of oven doors. She'd stolen his pie, but somehow, in the space of an hour, he'd given her something infinitely more valuable: hope, dignity, and the chance to rebuild her life one day at a time. As she pushed open the door to her new room and saw the clean bed waiting for her, Clara Mitchell allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of mixing bowls clinking in the kitchen below. For a moment, she lay still in the narrow bed, disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of clean sheets against her skin and a roof over her head. The small room smelled of lavender soap and fresh air instead of the damp mustiness of doorways and abandoned buildings where she'd spent recent nights. Sunlight filtered through gingham curtains, casting cheerful patterns across whitewashed walls. The room was sparse but thoughtfully arranged: a simple oak dresser, a mirror with only the smallest crack in one corner, and a washstand with a blue ceramic pitcher and basin. Someone had placed fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the windowsill, their purple and yellow petals bright against the morning light. The sounds from downstairs grew more rhythmic: the steady thump of kneading dough, the whisper of flour being sifted, the gentle scrape of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls. Clara realized she was hearing the creation of the day's bread and pastries, the alchemy that transformed simple ingredients into the masterpieces she'd seen displayed in Brennan's window. She dressed quickly in the same worn clothes from yesterday, acutely aware of how shabby she must look. Her dark hair, once lustrous and carefully styled, hung limp around her shoulders. Her dress, which had been purchased from a fine shop in Boston, now bore the stains and tears of living rough. She tried to smooth the wrinkles with her hands, but there was only so much that could be done without proper cleaning and mending. When she descended the stairs, she found Thomas already deep in his morning routine. He stood at a massive wooden table, sleeves rolled up, working dough with the kind of methodical rhythm that spoke of years of practice. His hair was slightly mussed, and flour dusted his forearms like powdered snow. The kitchen was warm from the ovens, and the air was thick with the scent of rising yeast and baking bread. "Good morning," he said without looking up from his work. "Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself to whatever you need." Clara poured herself a cup from the blue enamel pot, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic to combat the morning chill. The coffee was strong and black, bitter enough to chase away the last traces of sleep. She'd grown accustomed to drinking whatever she could find: cold coffee dregs from restaurant garbage, weak tea made from used leaves, so this rich brew tasted like luxury. "What time do you usually start?" she asked, settling onto a tall stool near the work table. 3:30. Bread needs time to rise properly, and the breakfast crowd expects fresh rolls by 6. Thomas divided the dough into portions with practiced efficiency. "You don't need to get up this early. The front counter doesn't open until 7. Clara watched his hands as he shaped each roll, noticing the precise way he tucked the dough under itself to create tension on the surface. His movements were economical, wasting no motion, each gesture serving a specific purpose. There was artistry in it, but also pragmatism, the knowledge that every minute saved in preparation meant better service for customers. "I'd like to learn," she said impulsively. "If you don't mind teaching me." Thomas glanced up, surprised. "Most people think baking is just following recipes. It's not that simple." "I'm not most people." Clara set down her coffee cup. "I may not have practical skills, but I'm not afraid of hard work. And I'm a fast learner when someone takes the time to explain things properly." Something shifted in Thomas's expression: approval, perhaps, or recognition of genuine interest. Rather than mere politeness, he nodded toward the sink. "Wash your hands thoroughly, then tie your hair back. Can't have loose strands falling into the bread." Clara found a length of string in a drawer and bound her hair into a simple knot at the base of her neck. When she returned to the work table, Thomas had prepared a small portion of dough for her to practice with. "Feel the texture," he instructed, guiding her hands to the smooth surface. "This is what properly kneaded dough should feel like: elastic, but not tough, smooth, but not slippery. It should spring back when you press it gently." His hands covered hers briefly, showing her the correct motion for shaping rolls. Clara was acutely aware of the calluses on his palms, the warmth of his skin, the way he smelled of flour and vanilla, and something uniquely himself. When he stepped back to let her try alone, she felt an unexpected sense of loss. "Like this?" she asked, attempting to replicate his technique. "Close. Don't be afraid to use more pressure. The dough can handle it." Thomas moved to check the ovens, adjusting dampers and testing temperatures with practiced hands. "Tell me about your family's business. What was it like running a textile mill?" Clara's hands stilled on the dough. She'd grown accustomed to people avoiding the subject of her family's downfall, tiptoeing around the topic as if poverty were contagious. Thomas's direct question caught her off guard. "I didn't run it," she admitted. "Father never thought I needed to understand the business side. I was supposed to marry well and manage a household, not concern myself with manufacturing and finance. But you observed. You learned things without meaning to." It was a statement rather than a question, and Clara realized he was right. She'd absorbed information simply by growing up in a family where business was discussed at dinner tables and in drawing rooms. "The mill employed 300 people at its peak," she said, returning to shaping the dough. "Father specialized in fine woolens fabric for suits and dresses that sold to shops in New York and Philadelphia. He was proud of the quality. Said you could tell Brennan wool from across a room because of the way it held color and kept its shape. What happened with the fire? Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she kept working. Father always said it was an accident, but there were rumors. A competitor had been trying to buy him out for months, offering prices that were insulting. When Father refused, strange things started happening. Shipments delayed, orders mysteriously canceled, key workers suddenly leaving for other jobs. Thomas slid a tray of yesterday's leftover rolls into the oven to warm. You think it was deliberate? I don't know. The fire started in the office where all the records were kept. By the time the volunteer brigade arrived, everything was lost. The building, the machinery, the customer lists, the financial records. Without those, Father couldn't prove what was owed to him or collect on outstanding debts. And the insurance? Clara's laugh was bitter. The insurance company found reasons to deny the claim. Said Father had been negligent with fire safety, that he'd violated the terms of his policy. They tied everything up in court for months while we spent our savings on lawyers who promised results they couldn't deliver. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. So your father lost everything twice, once in the fire, once in the legal battles. He lost his purpose, Clara said quietly. The mill wasn't just his business. It was his identity. When that burned, he didn't know who he was anymore. Mother tried to keep his spirits up, but she was fighting her own battles. The social isolation was almost worse than the financial ruin. People we'd known for years suddenly couldn't see us on the street. Some people, Thomas corrected. Others probably wanted to help but didn't know how. Pride makes people uncomfortable on both sides. Those who need help are too proud to ask, and those who want to give it are too proud to risk being rebuffed. Clara considered this as she finished shaping her practice rolls. Thomas had given her a perspective she'd never considered, that perhaps not everyone had abandoned her family out of callousness or social climbing. Perhaps some had simply been as trapped by convention and uncertainty as she had been by circumstance. The front door chimed, announcing the arrival of the first customer. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and moved to the counter, greeting the elderly man with genuine warmth. Morning, Mr. Henderson. The usual? 2 loaves of wheat bread and a dozen of those cinnamon rolls my wife can't stop talking about. The customer's eyes found Clara in the kitchen, and she saw his expression change slightly, recognition followed by poorly concealed curiosity. Thomas wrapped the order efficiently, making no mention of Clara's presence. Tell Mrs. Henderson the apple preserves she traded me last week were the best I've ever tasted. Used them in yesterday's turnovers. The exchange continued with easy familiarity, but Clara noticed how Thomas positioned himself between her and the customers staring. When Mr. Henderson left, Thomas returned to the kitchen without comment. Does everyone in town know who I am? Clara asked. Most do. Millbrook isn't large enough for anonymity. Thomas began mixing batter for muffins. But knowing and understanding are different things. People see the surface, the family that fell from grace. They don't see the person underneath. More customers arrived as the morning progressed. Clara watched from the kitchen as Thomas served each one with the same courteous attention, regardless of whether they ordered 50 cents worth of rolls or $5 worth of wedding cake. He remembered names, asked after family members, and offered small kindnesses that weren't reflected in his prices. An extra roll for a child, a discount for a widow, credit extended to a farmer whose crop had failed. During a brief lull, Clara approached the counter. You give away a lot of food, Thomas shrugged. Good business practice. A hungry customer is a lost customer. Better to keep people fed and loyal than to chase immediate profit. That's not what my father believed. He always said charity was the enemy of capitalism. Your father sold fabric to wealthy people who could afford to pay full price. I sell food to working families who sometimes have to choose between bread and medicine." Thomas refilled the display case with fresh pastries. Different businesses, different rules. Clara absorbed this philosophy as she helped him arrange the day's offerings. Each item was a small work of art: croissants with perfectly laminated layers, muffins studded with fresh berries, cookies that were uniform in size and golden brown. The attention to detail was extraordinary, and she began to understand that Thomas's success came not just from generosity, but from genuine excellence. "How did you learn to bake like this?" she asked. "My grandfather mostly. He apprenticed in Dublin before coming to America, learned techniques that went back generations. But I also read everything I could find: French pastry books, German bread manuals, anything that would teach me something new." Thomas pulled a notebook from beneath the counter, its pages filled with handwritten recipes and detailed notes. "This is 15 years of experimentation. Every recipe was tested and retested until it was perfect. Every technique practiced until it became second nature." Clara studied the careful notations, the precise measurements, the modifications noted in different colored inks. "You're an artist. I'm a craftsman. There's a difference." Thomas closed the notebook. "Artists create for themselves. Craftsmen create for others. Everything I make has to serve a purpose: nourish people, bring them joy, give them something to look forward to." The lunch rush brought a steady stream of customers seeking fresh bread, meat pies, and Thomas's famous apple turnovers. Clara helped by wrapping orders and cleaning tables, gradually learning the rhythm of the restaurant. She noticed how Thomas managed multiple tasks, simultaneously sliding loaves from the oven while taking orders, decorating cakes while answering questions about ingredients. During a quiet moment, a young woman entered carrying a fussy baby. Her dress was clean but patched, her shoes worn thin at the heels. She approached the counter hesitantly. "Mr. Brennan, I was wondering. My husband's been laid off from the lumber mill, and we're a bit short this week. Could I possibly trade some mending work for a loaf of bread? I could fix those torn aprons hanging in your kitchen." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been meaning to ask someone about those aprons. Take 2 loaves, 1 white, 1 brown, and bring the mending back whenever it's convenient." After the woman left, Clara watched Thomas make notes in a ledger that seemed to track more than just monetary transactions. "Do you keep records of all your trades?" "Have to. Otherwise I'd lose track of who owes what to whom." Thomas showed her the ledger, filled with careful notations. "Mrs. Patterson mends clothes beautifully. Worth more than bread, really, but she needs to feel like she's earning what she takes. You're running a restaurant or a charity?" "Both. They're not mutually exclusive." Thomas closed the ledger. "You think I'm being foolish with money?" Clara considered her answer carefully. "I think you're being wise with people. Money comes and goes, but reputation lasts forever. People won't forget that you helped them when they needed it most." Something in Thomas's expression suggested she'd surprised him with her insight. He looked at her more carefully, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. The afternoon brought different challenges. A delivery of flour arrived with several bags torn, requiring careful salvaging of usable portions. A customer complained that yesterday's pie was too sweet, demanding a refund despite having eaten 3/4 of it. The kitchen sink developed a slow leak that needed immediate attention. Through it all, Clara watched Thomas handle each crisis with calm competence. He didn't get flustered or angry, didn't take problems personally. He simply solved them and moved on to the next task. There was something deeply attractive about his steadiness, his refusal to be rattled by the inevitable complications of running a business. As evening approached and the last customer departed, Clara helped Thomas clean the kitchen and prepare for the next day's baking. She'd learned to sort the good flour from the damaged bags, to properly wash mixing bowls so no soap residue remained. and to arrange the workspace for maximum efficiency. "You did well today," Thomas said as they finished the cleaning. "Better than I expected for someone with no restaurant experience. I had a good teacher." Clara hung up her apron, feeling more accomplished than she had in months. "And I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. Even the difficult customers? Especially them. Their satisfaction in solving problems, in turning a complaint into a compliment." Clara paused. "I haven't felt useful in a very long time." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. "Usefulness isn't about what you do. It's about how you approach what you do. You could have spent today feeling sorry for yourself or resentful about having to work. Instead, you threw yourself into learning something new. What choice did I have? More than you think. Attitude is always a choice, even when circumstances aren't." As Clara climbed the stairs to her room that night, she reflected on the truth of Thomas's words. She had chosen to embrace this opportunity rather than merely endure it. She'd chosen curiosity over self-pity, engagement over withdrawal. For the first time since her family's downfall, she felt like herself again, not the privileged young woman she'd been, but someone stronger and more resourceful. The sounds of Thomas preparing tomorrow's bread dough drifted up from the kitchen. Below, a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. As she prepared for bed, Clara realized that something fundamental had shifted during her first day at Brennan's restaurant. She'd begun to hope again, not just for survival but for the possibility of building something meaningful. From the ashes of her old life, the stolen pie had been the desperate act of a starving woman, but what she was creating now was the deliberate work of someone determined to earn her place in the world. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Mitchell looked forward to seeing what tomorrow would bring. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's first morning at Brennan's restaurant, and the rhythm of the work had become as natural as breathing. She could now predict when the breakfast rush would peak, knew which customers preferred their coffee black versus with cream, and had memorized the recipes for the most popular items. Her hands had grown steady with repetition, capable of folding dough without tearing it and decorating cakes with delicate precision, but it was the small changes that surprised her most. Her cheeks had filled out slightly from regular meals. Her hair had regained some of its former luster, and her posture had straightened with renewed confidence. The desperate, haunted look that had shadowed her eyes was slowly being replaced by something brighter purpose, perhaps, or simply the security of knowing where her next meal would come from. This particular morning brought an autumn storm that rattled the windows and sent customers scurrying through the door, seeking warmth and comfort. Clara had learned that weather directly affected business. Rainy days brought people craving soup and hot bread, while sunny afternoons meant increased demand for refreshing drinks and light pastries. She was arranging fresh scones in the display case when Mrs. Elmira Hartwell swept through the door, shaking rain from her expensive umbrella. The woman was Millbrook's unofficial social coordinator, a role she'd claimed through wealth, persistence, and an unshakable belief in her own importance. Her presence always changed the atmosphere of any room she entered. "Thomas, darling," Mrs. Hartwell called, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness reserved for people she considered beneath her station, but useful nonetheless. "I need to discuss the arrangements for the Harvest Festival. The Ladies' Auxiliary has decided to expand this year's bake sale." Thomas emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from his hands. Clara noticed the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way his natural warmth dimmed in Mrs. Hartwell's presence. It was a reaction she'd observed in other townspeople, automatic deference mixed with barely concealed resentment. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell. What can I do for you?" "Well, we'll need your usual contribution. Of course, those divine apple pies and perhaps some of your famous dinner rolls. But this year, we're hoping for something more substantial. The festival committee has decided to auction off premium baked goods to raise money for the new church organ." Clara continued her work, but listened carefully. She'd heard about the Harvest Festival from other customers, an annual event that brought together the entire county for food, music, and community celebration. For businesses like Brennan's, it represented a significant opportunity for exposure and sales. "What exactly are you looking for?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. Mrs. Hartwell settled herself at one of the small tables, arranging her skirts with theatrical precision. "Something spectacular. A wedding cake, perhaps, or one of those elaborate French pastries we've heard you're capable of making. Something that will demonstrate Millbrook's sophistication to visitors from the larger towns." "I see." Thomas glanced toward Clara, and she caught the flicker of irritation in his expression. "And the proceeds from this auction will go entirely to the church organ fund, naturally. Though I suppose we could arrange for a small portion to cover your ingredients." Clara felt her cheeks burn with second-hand indignation. Mrs. Hartwell was essentially asking Thomas to donate hours of skilled labor and expensive materials for a fraction of their value, all wrapped in the language of community service and civic duty. Thomas, however, responded with diplomatic calm. "I appreciate the church's needs, Mrs. Hartwell, but I'd need to see some compensation for a project of that scope. Perhaps we could discuss a commission arrangement, something that benefits both the church and my business." Mrs. Hartwell's smile tightened. "Oh, but Thomas, surely you understand the importance of community spirit. We all must make sacrifices for the greater good. Besides, think of the exposure people from 3 counties will see your work." "Exposure doesn't pay for flour and sugar," Thomas replied mildly. "Or the rent on this building." "Well, I hardly think someone in your position can afford to be selective about charitable opportunities," Mrs. Hartwell said, her veneer of sweetness beginning to crack. "After all, this restaurant depends on community goodwill, doesn't it?" The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara set down the tray she'd been holding, her hands trembling with anger. She'd witnessed this kind of social manipulation in her former life, the way wealthy people used their influence to extract free labor from those they considered their inferiors. "Mrs. Hartwell," Clara said, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "Perhaps you're not aware that premium baking requires rare ingredients and specialized techniques. A wedding cake of the quality you're describing would normally cost $30 to $40. Surely the church organ fund could allocate a portion of that to compensate Mr. Brennan for his materials and expertise." Mrs. Hartwell turned toward Clara with the slow deliberation of a predator selecting prey. "And you are?" "Clara Mitchell. I work here, Mitchell." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "You're Edgar Mitchell's daughter. How interesting. I heard you've fallen on difficult times." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to remind Clara of her changed circumstances and put her back in her place. In her former life, Clara might have withered under such social pressure. Now, however, she felt something different rising in her chest, not shame, but defiance. "Yes," Clara said evenly. "I've learned the value of honest work and fair compensation. 2 things that seem to have escaped the attention of some people in this community." Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me in that tone? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Clara replied. "You're someone who expects other people to subsidize your charitable projects while taking all the credit for their success." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood frozen behind the counter, caught between admiration for Clara's courage and concern for the potential consequences. Mrs. Hartwell rose from her chair with imperial dignity, gathering her purse and umbrella-like armor. "I see that working in service has not improved your manners, Miss Mitchell. Thomas, I trust you'll reconsider your position once you've had time to think about what's truly best for your business." She swept out of the restaurant, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of unspoken threats. Clara stood motionless, suddenly aware of what she'd done. In defending Thomas, she might have just destroyed his relationship with one of the town's most influential families. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have spoken. I may have just cost you important customers." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the door through which Mrs. Hartwell had departed. Then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh, not bitter or sarcastic, but genuinely amused. "Cost me customers? Clara, that woman hasn't paid full price for anything in this restaurant in 5 years. She comes in, orders elaborate special items, then claims they're for community purposes and expects massive discounts. I've been looking for a polite way to refuse her demands for months. But she has influence. She could turn people against your business. She could try." Thomas moved to the coffee pot and poured 2 cups. "But most people in this town know the difference between genuine community service and social manipulation. Mrs. Hartwell's bark is worse than her bite." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warm cup to steady her hands. "In my old life, people like Mrs. Hartwell had real power. They could destroy reputations, ruin business relationships, exclude entire families from society. That's because your old life revolved around people who had nothing better to do than play social games." Thomas leaned against the counter. "Most folks here are too busy earning an honest living to worry about artificial hierarchies." "I used to be part of those artificial hierarchies," Clara admitted. "I attended the same charity committees, participated in the same social rituals. I thought they mattered. What changed your mind?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Hunger, I suppose. It's difficult to care about social precedents when you're wondering where your next meal will come from. Amazing how quickly perspective shifts when you're the one in need instead of the one dispensing charity." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, a burly man who worked at the lumber mill. His clothes were damp from the rain, and his face bore the tired expression of someone who'd already put in a half-day's work before most people had breakfast. "Morning, Thomas. Got any of that beef stew left from yesterday? Last bowl, but it's yours if you want it. Coffee to go with it, please." Jake settled onto a stool at the counter, nodding politely to Clara. "Heard Mrs. Hartwell came through here earlier. Looked like she swallowed something sour when she left." Thomas ladled stew into a large bowl and added fresh bread on the side. "She was recruiting for the Harvest Festival bake sale." "Ah," Jake's expression suggested he understood perfectly. "Let me guess, wanted you to donate something expensive and complicated for free? Something like that. Women have more nerve than a toothache. Last year she talked my wife into making 3 quilts for the church auction, then claimed all the credit when they brought in good money." Jake tasted the stew and sighed with satisfaction. "This hits the spot. You've got a gift, Thomas." "Just good ingredients and patience," Thomas replied, but Clara could see the pleasure he took in the compliment. "Speaking of the festival," Jake continued, "you planning to enter anything in the baking competition this year? Miller's been bragging about his cornbread recipe, says it's unbeatable." Thomas exchanged a glance with Clara. "I hadn't really considered it." "You should. That cornbread of yours is twice as good as Miller's, and everyone knows it. Someone gave him some real competition." After Jake left, Clara found herself curious about this baking competition. "Do you usually participate in festival events?" "Not in recent years. Too much politics, too many personalities like Mrs. Hartwell." Thomas began preparing vegetables for the lunch soup. "But Jake's right about Miller. He's been claiming the cornbread prize for 3 years running, mostly because no one else bothers to challenge him. What would happen if you won? Prize money, mostly. $50 and a ribbon. More importantly, bragging rights and the kind of advertising you can't buy." Clara watched him work, noting the precision with which he diced onions and celery. An idea was forming in her mind, something that would demonstrate Thomas's skills while thumbing their collective nose at Mrs. Hartwell's expectations. "What if we entered together?" she suggested. "Not just cornbread, but multiple categories. Show everyone what Brennan's restaurant is really capable of." Thomas paused in his chopping. "We? I've been learning your techniques for weeks. I could handle some of the simpler items while you focus on the advanced pieces. We could mount a coordinated campaign, show the whole county what real baking looks like. That would be a lot of work. And expensive, all those ingredients, all that time, double quotes. But think of the potential return. If we won even half the categories we entered, the prize money would cover our costs. And the reputation boost could bring in customers from miles around." Thomas set down his knife and leaned against the work table. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. Mrs. Hartwell wants to use your skills for her own purposes. Why not use them for ours instead? And if we lose? If Miller's cornbread really is better than mine?" Clara smiled, feeling more confident than she had in months. "Then we'll know where we stand. But somehow, I doubt that's going to be a problem." The rest of the morning passed in animated discussion as they refined their festival strategy. Clara suggested entering categories that would showcase different aspects of Thomas's abilities: bread, pastries, preserves, even candy making. Thomas contributed technical knowledge about timing, ingredient sourcing, and presentation. By the time the lunch rush began, they had outlined an ambitious plan that would require weeks of preparation and considerable financial investment. It was risky, potentially expensive, and absolutely perfect. "There's one thing we need to discuss," Thomas said as they served the afternoon customers. "If we do this, we're partners in it. Equal shares of the work, equal shares of any winnings. I couldn't accept that. You're the master baker. I'm just learning. You're the one who suggested it, and you'll be doing half the work. Besides," Thomas's expression grew serious, "I've been thinking about expanding the business anyway. Maybe it's time to test whether this town is ready for something more ambitious than basic bread and butter." Clara felt a thrill of excitement mixed with terror. She was being offered not just a job, but a partnership in something that could transform both their lives. It was an opportunity she never could have imagined 3 weeks ago when she'd stolen that pie. "What would your grandfather say about taking on a partner?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "He'd say that the best recipes are improved by the right additions. And he'd probably point out that every successful business needs someone who understands both the kitchen and the customers. Then let's do it. Let's show Millbrook what we're really capable of." As they shook hands on their agreement, Clara realized that somewhere between learning to knead dough and standing up to Mrs. Hartwell, she'd stopped being a charity case and started being a partner. The transformation wasn't complete. There were still skills to learn, relationships to build, and challenges to overcome, but the foundation was solid. The stolen pie had brought her to Brennan's restaurant as a desperate thief. Now she was preparing to leave it as an equal partner in an enterprise that could reshape both their futures. It was a metamorphosis that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. But then again, Clara was learning that transformation often came disguised as opportunity. The autumn storm continued to rage outside, but inside the warm kitchen of Brennan's restaurant, 2 people were planning something that would change everything. And for the first time since her family's downfall, Clara Mitchell was looking forward to taking a risk rather than simply trying to survive one. The days leading up to the Harvest Festival transformed Brennan's restaurant into something resembling a military operation. Clara had never imagined that baking could be so intensely strategic, requiring precise timing, careful resource allocation, and contingency planning that would make a general proud. She found herself rising even earlier than Thomas, arriving in the kitchen by 3 in the morning to begin preparations that would continue until well past sunset. Their plan had evolved into something far more ambitious than either had initially envisioned. They would enter 7 different categories: bread, cornbread, fruit preserves, apple pie, chocolate cake, dinner rolls, and an open category that allowed for creative interpretation. Each entry required perfect execution, and there would be no opportunity for second chances. Clara discovered muscles she didn't know she possessed as she kneaded batch after batch of experimental dough, testing variations in flour types, yeast amounts, and rising times. Her hands, which had once been soft and pampered, developed calluses that she wore like badges of honor. Thomas pushed both of them relentlessly, demanding perfection not out of cruelty, but from genuine understanding of what they were attempting. "The judges won't just be tasting our food," he explained as they worked side by side on their 15th attempt at the perfect cornbread recipe. "They'll be evaluating our technique, our presentation, our consistency. Every detail matters." Clara learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished good baking from exceptional baking. The way properly risen bread sounded when tapped. The precise shade of golden brown that indicated optimal caramelization. The delicate balance between sweet and tart that made preserves memorable rather than merely adequate. She absorbed Thomas's knowledge like a sponge, surprising both of them with her intuitive understanding of flavors and textures. Their partnership had evolved into something seamless and complementary. Thomas possessed the technical expertise and years of experience, while Clara contributed strategic thinking and an outsider's perspective on presentation and marketing. She suggested modifications to traditional recipes that made them more appealing to modern palates, while he refined her ideas through practical application and kitchen wisdom. The physical demands of their preparation schedule brought unexpected intimacy. Working in the confined space of the kitchen, they developed an awareness of each other's movements and rhythms that bordered on telepathic. Clara learned to anticipate when Thomas needed a particular tool or ingredient, while he instinctively adjusted his positioning to accommodate her workspace requirements. It was during one of these late-night sessions, as they worked together on a particularly challenging chocolate cake recipe, that Clara made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about Thomas Brennan. She had gone to his office to retrieve the scale needed for precise measurements and accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As she bent to collect them, her eye caught familiar letterhead correspondence from the First National Bank of Chicago, addressed to Mr. T.J. Brennan regarding investment portfolio management and trust fund distributions. Clara froze, the papers scattered around her feet. The figures mentioned in the visible portions of the letters contained more zeros than she'd seen since her family's bankruptcy. These weren't the financial documents of a small-town baker struggling to make ends meet. They were the papers of someone with substantial wealth, old wealth, carefully managed and quietly maintained. "Clara?" Thomas's voice came from the kitchen. "Did you find the scale?" "Yes," she called back, hastily gathering the papers without reading further. Just dropping everything tonight, apparently. But as she returned to the kitchen, her mind raced with questions. If Thomas possessed the kind of wealth suggested by those documents, why was he living above a small restaurant in Millbrook? Why the careful attention to every penny spent on ingredients? Why the genuine concern about the cost of their festival preparations? She watched him as they worked, noting details she'd previously overlooked. His clothes, while simple, were expertly tailored and made from quality materials. His hands, though calloused from baking, bore the subtle signs of someone who'd never known true manual labor until he chose it. His vocabulary occasionally revealed an education far beyond what most small-town business owners possessed. "Thomas," she said carefully as they waited for the cake layers to bake, "can I ask you something personal?" "Depends how personal," he replied, but his tone was encouraging rather than defensive. "Why Millbrook? A baker with your skills could succeed anywhere: Chicago, New York, San Francisco. Why choose a small town where most people think a fancy dessert is store-bought ice cream?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, checking the oven temperature with methodical precision. Maybe I like the simplicity. No pretension, no artificial competition, just honest work for honest people. But surely you had opportunities elsewhere. Training like yours doesn't happen by accident. Training like mine happened because my grandfather believed in excellence regardless of circumstances. Thomas turned to face her directly. Why are you asking? Clara hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without revealing what she'd accidentally discovered. I suppose I'm trying to understand why someone would choose limitation over possibility. It seems unusual. Maybe I've seen enough possibilities to know its price. Thomas's expression had grown guarded. Some opportunities cost more than their worth. There was pain in his voice, old pain, carefully buried but not entirely healed. Clara recognized it because she carried similar wounds from her own fall. From privilege. The difference was that Thomas seemed to have chosen his exile while hers had been imposed by circumstances. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Samuel Morrison, Jake's younger brother, who served as Millbrook's only physician. He entered through the back door, as was his habit when making late-night visits, his medical bag in one hand and his hat dripping with evening drizzle. "Sorry to bother you folks," Dr. Morrison said, "but I've got a situation that requires some of Thomas's special talents." "Medical emergency?" Thomas asked, immediately alert. "Mrs. Chun. She's been in labor for 18 hours, and the baby's in a difficult position. I need to keep her strength up, but she can't keep anything down except that ginger tea blend you make. Could you possibly ... double quotes, of course." Thomas was already moving toward his herb collection. "How much do you need?" "Enough for several days, if possible. And maybe some of that honey wheat bread. Something gentle on the stomach but nourishing." Clara watched in fascination as Thomas prepared what was clearly a familiar request. He measured herbs with pharmaceutical precision, explaining to Dr. Morrison the exact steeping time and dosage recommendations. His knowledge extended far beyond culinary applications. He understood the medicinal properties of his ingredients and their interactions with various health conditions. "You've done this before," Clara observed as Thomas packaged the prepared items. "Sam's been asking for specialized preparation since he started practicing here," Thomas explained. "Turns out baking and medicine have more in common than most people realize. Both require precise measurements, understanding of chemical reactions, and attention to timing." Dr. Morrison departed with grateful thanks, leaving Clara with yet another piece of the puzzle that was Thomas Brennan. A wealthy man living simply, a master baker with extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, someone who regularly provided specialized preparations for medical emergencies. Each revelation deepened the mystery while making her more curious about his true story. "Thomas," she said as they returned to their cake preparation, "I accidentally saw some papers on your desk earlier. Financial documents that suggest you have resources beyond what this restaurant generates." Thomas went very still, his hands pausing in their measurement of cocoa powder. "What papers?" "Bank correspondence, investment statements." "I wasn't prying. I knocked them over reaching for the scale." Clara met his eyes directly. "I'm not asking for details you don't want to share. But I need to know if our partnership is built on false pretenses." "What kind of false pretenses?" "If you're secretly wealthy, then everything I've believed about our situation is wrong. The careful budgeting, the concern about ingredient costs, the risk we're taking with the festival competition, none of it makes sense if you have unlimited resources." Thomas set down his measuring tools and leaned against the work table. For several minutes, the only sound was the gentle bubbling of the cake batter and the whisper of gas flames under the ovens. "My full name is Thomas James Brennan III," he said finally. "My grandfather founded Brennan Industries steel manufacturing, primarily railroad components. By the time my father inherited the business, we were one of the largest industrial concerns in the Midwest. Clara absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. And you walked away from all of that to bake bread in Millbrook? I didn't walk away, I was pushed. Thomas's voice carried years of carefully controlled anger. My father and I disagreed about business practices, worker safety, environmental responsibility, fair wages. He believed profit justified any means. I believed some things were more important than money. So you left? I was given an ultimatum: conform to his vision or forfeit any claim to the family business. I chose principle over profit. Thomas managed a bitter smile. He was so confident I'd come crawling back that he set up a trust fund to provide basic living expenses, his way of ensuring I could survive my rebellion without actually suffering. And you've been living on that trust fund? Barely touching it. Most months, the restaurant income covers everything I need. The trust money sits in accounts, accumulating interest and reminding me daily of what I rejected. Thomas resumed his measuring, movements sharp with residual frustration. I could buy every ingredient in this competition 10 times over without denting those accounts. But using that money would mean accepting that my father was right, that principles are luxuries only the wealthy can afford. Clara understood now. Why Thomas lived so carefully, why every business decision was weighed against actual earned income rather than inherited wealth. He was proving to himself, and perhaps to his father, that his choices had meaning beyond mere rebellion. Does anyone else in town know? She asked. Dr. Morrison suspects something. He's too observant not to notice inconsistencies. But most people see what they expect to see. A baker who inherited his grandfather's recipes and decided to follow that path instead of seeking fortune elsewhere. And you've never been tempted to use the money, even for good causes? Every day. Do you know how many problems in this town could be solved with a fraction of what's sitting in those accounts? Thomas's hands stilled again. But the moment I start spending Brennan Industries' money, even for worthy causes, I become complicit in how it was earned. Every dollar in those accounts represents compromises I refuse to make. Clara processed this revelation, understanding finally why Thomas had been so generous with his own earned income while being scrupulous about actual business expenses. He was drawing a moral line between money he'd earned through his own labor and wealth he'd inherited through questionable means. Our festival entry, she said slowly. You want to win with money you've actually earned. I want to prove that honest work can compete with inherited advantage. That quality and integrity can triumph over resources and connections. Thomas met her eyes. Your father's textile mill was destroyed by people who had more money than ethics. Mrs. Hartwell expects free labor because her social position gives her power over others. I've spent 5 years trying to demonstrate that there's another way. And if we lose, will Miller's connections and Mrs. Hartwell's influence overcome our actual baking skills? Then at least we'll know we competed honestly. Sometimes the principle matters more than the outcome. Clara found herself thinking of her father, who had built his business through fair dealing and quality products, only to lose everything to competitors who operated by different rules. Thomas was fighting the same battle her father had lost, but with a crucial difference: he had chosen his battlefield and prepared his weapons carefully. There's something you should know, she said. I didn't just stumble into poverty. My family's downfall wasn't entirely accidental. Thomas looked up sharply. What do you mean? The fire that destroyed our mill wasn't an accident. The insurance company that denied our claims wasn't acting in good faith. The competitors who moved in to capture our contracts had inside information about our financial struggles. Clara's voice grew stronger as she spoke. My father was too honest to recognize how dishonest his enemies were willing to be. Do you have proof? Nothing that would stand up in court. But patterns, connections, coincidences that add up to something more sinister. Clara straightened her shoulders. I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop running from that knowledge and start using it. Thomas studied her face carefully. What are you suggesting? That we're not just entering a baking competition. We're making a statement about the kind of business practices this community should accept. And maybe, if we win, we'll have the platform to start addressing some larger problems. As they returned to their preparations, both of them understood that the stakes had risen far beyond prize money and bragging rights. They were competing not just against other bakers, but against a system that rewarded connections over competence, wealth over worth, and influence over integrity. The chocolate cake that emerged from the oven that night was perfect, moist, rich, and flawlessly textured. But more importantly, it represented something neither Clara nor Thomas could have achieved alone: the synthesis of technical skill, moral purpose, and shared determination to prove that honest work could triumph over inherited advantage. Harvest Festival was still days away, but the real competition had already begun. And for the first time since her family's destruction, Clara Mitchell felt ready to fight back. The morning of the Harvest Festival dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden October light that made even the most ordinary objects appear magical. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, while behind her the organized chaos of final preparations filled every available surface with cooling racks, covered dishes, and carefully labeled containers. They had been working since midnight, timing each recipe to peak at precisely the right moment for judging. The cornbread still steamed from the oven, the preserves glowed like liquid jewels in their glass jars, and the chocolate cake sat like a dark masterpiece under its protective dome. 7 entries, each representing weeks of experimentation and refinement, now ready to face the scrutiny of judges who held the power to validate or destroy their efforts. Thomas moved through the kitchen with the focused intensity of a conductor leading a symphony. Every gesture was purposeful, every glance calculated to ensure that nothing had been forgotten or compromised. Clara had learned to read his moods through these subtle physical cues: the slight tightening around his eyes when he was concerned, the way his shoulders relaxed when he was satisfied with a result, the unconscious smile that appeared when he tasted something truly exceptional. "The bread transport containers are in the wagon," Clara reported, checking items off their meticulously prepared list. Preserves secured, dinner rolls wrapped and warming, apple pie cooling to the perfect serving temperature. And the cornbread? Another 10 minutes. "I've been testing it every 2 minutes. It's going to be absolutely perfect." Thomas nodded, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw. This wasn't just about winning a competition. It was about proving that their approach, their values, could triumph. In a contest that typically rewarded connections over competence, the festival grounds sprawled across the town common, a transformed landscape of colorful booths, striped, tents, and the kind of bustling activity that only occurred once a year. Clara had attended this event as a child, but always from the privileged perspective of someone whose family sponsored rather than participated. Now she saw it through different eyes: the careful way vendors arranged their displays to catch the best light, the nervous energy of competitors making final adjustments, the genuine community spirit that brought together people from across the county. Their assigned space in the baking pavilion was strategically located near the center, where judges and visitors would naturally congregate. Clara had specifically requested this placement, understanding that visibility could be as important as quality in influencing public opinion. They arranged their entries with the precision of a museum exhibition, each item positioned to complement the others while showcasing individual excellence. "Brennan's Restaurant," announced a familiar voice behind them. "I should have expected to see you here." They turned to find Robert Miller approaching their display, his own cornbread entry balanced in his hands. Miller was a large man with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from 3 consecutive victories and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. His cornbread was golden and aromatic, clearly the product of someone who understood the fundamentals of the craft. "Miller," Thomas replied evenly. "Good to see some real competition this year," Competition? Miller laughed, but there was an edge to it. Son, I've been winning this category since before you knew the difference between baking powder and baking soda. This year won't be any different. Clara stepped forward, studying Miller's entry with the critical eye she'd developed over weeks of intensive preparation. That's a beautiful golden color. Honey in the batter? Family secret, Miller replied, but his chest puffed slightly with pride. 4 generations of prize-winning recipes. Impressive, Clara said sincerely, though I noticed the crumb structure suggests perhaps a touch of too much sugar. It can sometimes overwhelm the corn flavor in competition judging. Miller's confidence flickered momentarily. What would you know about competition judging? Enough to know that subtle flavors often score higher than dramatic ones. But I'm sure the judges will appreciate the traditional approach. Clara smiled pleasantly, but Thomas caught the strategic glint in her eye as Miller moved away. Looking less certain than when he'd arrived, Thomas leaned close to Clara's ear. Psychological warfare? Gentle misdirection. I studied his recipe methodology. For weeks that cornbread is technically excellent, but predictable. Ours has the same technical quality, but with innovations he's never considered. And if you're wrong, then we lose graciously and learn something valuable. But I don't think I'm wrong. The morning progressed with a steady stream of curious visitors, examining their display. Clara had insisted on creating information cards for each entry, describing not just ingredients, but techniques and inspirations. It was an approach that elevated their presentation above the typical county fair standard, and she could see people responding to the additional layer of sophistication. Judge Margaret Fairfax arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, moving through the pavilion with the systematic attention of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. She was a renowned baker from the state capital, brought in specifically to ensure impartial evaluation. Her presence commanded respect from both competitors and spectators. "Good morning," Judge Fairfax said, approaching their display. "Brennan's Restaurant. I've heard interesting things about your establishment. All positive, I hope," Thomas replied. "Professional. Curiosity, mostly. It's unusual to see such ambitious entries from a small-town bakery." Judge Fairfax examined their cornbread with professional intensity. "This has an intriguing color variation. What creates that effect?" "A blend of white and yellow cornmeal, with small additions of fresh corn kernels for texture contrast," Clara explained. "The technique maintains traditional flavor profiles while adding visual and textural interest." Judge Fairfax made notes on her evaluation sheet. "And the preserves?" 3 varieties: traditional strawberry, spiced pear with cardamom, and experimental blackberry lavender. Each represents a different approach to balancing fruit characteristics with complementary flavors. Blackberry lavender. Judge Fairfax's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite adventurous for a county fair." "Sometimes adventure is worth the risk," Thomas said quietly. As Judge Fairfax moved to their other entries, Clara noticed Mrs. Hartwell approaching from across the pavilion. The woman had clearly dressed for maximum social impact, an elaborate hat topped with silk flowers, a dress that probably cost more than most families spent on clothing in a year, and the kind of jewelry that announced wealth without regard for taste or appropriateness. "Judge Fairfax," Mrs. Hartwell called, her voice carrying across the crowded space. "How wonderful to see you again. I trust you're finding our local entries adequate?" The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Clara felt her jaw clench involuntarily. Mrs. Hartwell was positioning herself as the sophisticated insider, subtly suggesting that rural competitors couldn't possibly meet urban standards. "I'm finding them quite impressive, actually," Judge Fairfax replied diplomatically. "The quality level exceeds my expectations." "Oh well, some of our establishments do try to elevate themselves above their circumstances." Mrs. Hartwell's gaze landed pointedly on Clara and Thomas. Though, of course, true sophistication requires more than ambition. Judge Fairfax followed Mrs. Hartwell's look, her expression becoming noticeably cooler. In my experience, Mrs. Hartwell, true sophistication is demonstrated through the work itself, not through commentary about others' efforts. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward the judge. Mrs. Hartwell's face flushed, but she maintained her artificial smile as she moved away, no doubt planning to seek influence through other channels. "Don't let her rattle you," Judge Fairfax said quietly to Clara and Thomas. "I've encountered that type in every community I've visited. They mistake social position for actual authority." "Have you judged many county competitions?" Clara asked. 23 years of them. I've learned to recognize genuine quality regardless of its source." Judge Fairfax smiled slightly. "And I've also learned to ignore attempts at social manipulation. The food speaks for itself." As the morning progressed, Clara noticed patterns in how different entries were received by both judges and visitors. The traditional approaches commanded respect but little excitement, while truly innovative items generated curiosity but sometimes skepticism. Their strategy of familiar techniques with subtle improvements seemed to be hitting the optimal balance. Dr. Morrison appeared at their booth during the midday break, his medical bag replaced by a small basket containing what appeared to be his own contribution to the festival's charitable auction. "How are you folks holding up?" he asked, examining their display with professional interest. "Nervous but confident," Thomas replied. "How's Mrs. Chun?" "Delivered a healthy boy this morning. That ginger tea of yours made all the difference." She was able to maintain her strength through the final hours. Dr. Morrison paused. "I wanted to thank you properly and maybe discuss something that's been on my mind." "What's that?" "This town needs a proper pharmacy. The nearest one is 30 miles away, and I'm constantly dealing with situations where immediate access to specific preparations could save lives." Dr. Morrison lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about the medicinal aspects of what you do. Here, the herbal knowledge, the precision with measurements and timing. Have you ever considered expanding in that direction?" Clara felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of opportunity they'd discussed, a way to use Thomas's skills for broader community benefit while building a more substantial business foundation. "It's an intriguing idea," Thomas said carefully. "But pharmaceutical preparation requires licensing, regulations, oversight. All manageable with the right partners and proper procedures. I'd be willing to provide the medical supervision and licensing requirements. You'd provide the technical expertise and facilities." Dr. Morrison smiled. "Think about it. This community could have access to custom preparations, medicinal teas, specialized treatments that aren't available through standard channels." "And the financial requirements?" Clara asked. "Modest initial investment for proper equipment and inventory. The real capital would be knowledge and time, both of which you already possess." Dr. Morrison glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I've been discussing this with some colleagues in the state capital. There's growing interest in traditional medicinal preparations, especially when they're produced with modern precision and safety standards." After Dr. Morrison left, Clara and Thomas found themselves facing a future that seemed to expand with each conversation. The festival competition had begun as a way to prove their baking skills, but it was evolving into something much larger, a platform for demonstrating the kind of community-focused business model they both believed in. "It's a lot to consider," Thomas said as they watched the judges begin their final evaluations. "But it's the right kind of lot," Clara replied. "Everything we've been working toward points in this direction. The baking skills, the community relationships, the moral foundations, they all align with what Dr. Morrison is suggesting." Judge Fairfax returned to their display for final tastings, working through each entry with the methodical attention of someone who understood that her decisions would affect not just winners and losers, but the ongoing relationships within the community. Clara watched her face carefully, looking for any hint of reaction, but the judge maintained professional neutrality throughout her evaluation. "Thank you for an exceptional presentation," Judge Fairfax said as she completed her notes. "Results will be announced at 4 o'clock. The waiting period that followed was excruciating. Clara and Thomas occupied themselves by visiting other booths, observing the festival's various activities, and trying to maintain normal conversation while their minds raced with possibilities and fears. They had invested more than time and ingredients in this competition. They had staked their future on the belief that quality and integrity could triumph over connections and tradition. At 3:30, they returned to the baking pavilion to find a crowd already gathering around the judging platform. Miller stood near the front, his confidence apparently restored. Mrs. Hartwell held court among a group of well-dressed visitors from neighboring towns, no doubt promoting her own version of events regardless of actual results. Judge Fairfax took the platform precisely at 4 o'clock, carrying a sheet of results and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested she understood the weight of her announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, this year's competition has been exceptional in both quality and innovation. The judges' decisions were difficult, and every entry represented skill and dedication worthy of recognition." Clara felt Thomas's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing as they prepared to learn whether their gamble had succeeded or failed. Around them, the crowd fell silent, understanding that these announcements would reshape relationships and reputations throughout the coming year. "In the category of cornbread," Judge Fairfax continued, "the winning entry demonstrates technical excellence combined with subtle innovation that enhances rather than overwhelms traditional flavors. First place goes to Brennan's Restaurant." The applause that followed seemed distant to Clara's ears, muffled by the roaring of blood through her head. They had won their first category, defeating Miller's 3-year winning streak. Thomas squeezed her hand tighter, his own surprise evident in his sudden stillness. But Judge Fairfax wasn't finished. Category by category, she announced results that exceeded their most optimistic projections. First place in preserves, second place in dinner rolls, first place in chocolate cake. By the time she reached the final announcements, Brennan's Restaurant had accumulated more prizes than any single establishment in the festival's 20-year history. And finally, Judge Fairfax said, "This year's grand champion awarded to the establishment demonstrating the highest overall excellence across multiple categories, Brennan's Restaurant." The crowd's reaction was mixed enthusiastic applause from supporters, stunned silence from competitors, and barely concealed dismay from Mrs. Hartwell's faction. But Clara heard none of it. All her attention was focused on Thomas's face, where she reflected the same mixture of triumph, relief, and possibility that she felt coursing through her own chest. They had done more than win a competition. They had proven that their approach, their values, could succeed in direct confrontation with the old ways of doing things. And in that proof lay the foundation for everything they hoped to build together, the celebration at Brennan's Restaurant. That evening was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. Word of their festival triumph had spread throughout Millbrook with the speed of wildfire, bringing a steady stream of well-wishers, curious townspeople, and customers eager to taste the award-winning recipes for themselves. The small dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter, filled with people who had rarely spoken to each other, but were now united in their pride for local success. Clara moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, accepting congratulations and discussing the technical aspects of their entries with anyone interested enough to ask. She had transformed from the desperate woman who'd stolen a pie just weeks ago into someone whose opinions on baking techniques were sought and respected. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had gained more social standing through honest work than she'd ever possessed through inherited wealth. Thomas stood behind the counter, cutting generous portions of their prize-winning chocolate cake for anyone who requested a taste. His normally reserved demeanor had given way to something approaching jovial relaxation, though Clara noticed he still carefully tracked every ingredient used and every dollar spent. Old habits of fiscal responsibility died hard, even in celebration. "Miss Mitchell," called a voice from near the door. Clara turned to see Judge Fairfax entering the restaurant, still carrying the leather portfolio she'd used during the competition. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I wanted to discuss your entries in more detail." "Of course, Judge Fairfax. Would you like some coffee, a piece of cake?" "Both, if you're offering." Judge Fairfax settled at one of the small tables. "I've been judging competitions for over 2 decades, and I've rarely seen such a comprehensive demonstration of technical skill combined with creative intelligence." Clara poured coffee and cut a fresh piece of cake, her hands steady despite the praise. "Thomas deserves the credit for the technical foundation. I just suggested some modifications based on modern palate preferences. Don't underestimate your contributions. The strategic thinking behind your presentations, the psychological insights you demonstrated with competitors, those aren't skills that come from recipe books." Judge Fairfax tasted the cake thoughtfully. "Have you considered entering regional competitions, state-level events?" The suggestion caught Clara off guard. "We hadn't thought beyond today, honestly." "You should. There's a growing movement toward artisanal food production, particularly in urban markets. Establishments like yours focused on quality, community connection, and innovative applications of traditional techniques are exactly what sophisticated consumers are seeking." Thomas joined their conversation during a brief lull in the evening. Rush. Regional competitions would mean significant travel, time away from the restaurant, substantial entry fees. They would also mean exposure to markets that could transform your business, Judge Fairfax countered. "I know distributors in Chicago and St. Louis who are actively seeking products like your preserves. Restaurant suppliers who would pay premium prices for your quality of bread. Specialty shops that cater to customers willing to spend appropriately for genuine excellence." Clara felt her pulse quicken. This was the kind of opportunity she'd learned to recognize, the moment when careful preparation met unexpected possibility. What would regional competition involve? Multiple categories over 3 days, judged by panels of industry professionals. Cash prizes are substantial, but the real value lies in the professional connections and business opportunities that result. Judge Fairfax pulled papers from her portfolio. "I took the liberty of bringing information about next spring's Midwest Regional Competition in Chicago. Entry deadline is December 1st. Thomas studied the documents with the same careful attention he gave to recipe modifications. "The entry fees alone would cost more than we've ever spent on ingredients. But the potential return could fund business expansion for years," Clara pointed out. "And we'd be competing against the best in multiple states, a real test of whether our approaches work beyond local markets." "There's something else to consider," Judge Fairfax said. "I've been approached by a publisher in New York who specializes in culinary texts. They're interested in commissioning a cookbook focused on innovative applications of traditional American recipes. Your work today suggests you might be ideal candidates for such a project." Clara's mind raced with possibilities. A cookbook would provide both income and professional credibility, establishing them as recognized experts rather than simply local success stories. It would also create a permanent record of their techniques and philosophies, something that could outlast any individual business venture. "We'd need time to consider all this," Thomas said, though Clara could see the interest sparking in his expression. "Of course. I'll be returning to the state capitol tomorrow, but I've left my contact information with the competition materials. Don't wait too long to decide. Opportunities like these don't remain open indefinitely." After Judge Fairfax departed, Clara and Thomas found themselves alone for the first time since the morning's preparations began. The restaurant was finally quiet, chairs stacked on clean tables, dishes washed and put away. They sat across from each other at their favorite table, sharing the last piece of their award-winning cornbread and processing the day's overwhelming success. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in doorways and stealing food to survive, Clara said quietly. Tonight, I'm being invited to write cookbooks and compete nationally. It doesn't feel real. Success rarely does, especially when it comes quickly. Thomas refilled their coffee cups. The question is what we do with it. You mean whether we expand or stay comfortable with what we have? I mean whether we remember why we started this in the first place. Thomas leaned back in his chair. When I left my family's business, I swore I'd never again be part of something that prioritized growth over principles. But growth itself isn't evil, it's what drives the growth that matters. Clara considered this distinction. Dr. Morrison's pharmaceutical proposal, that's growth driven by community need. The regional competitions could provide resources to serve more people. Even the cookbook could share our approaches with others facing similar challenges. And the risk of losing ourselves in the process? The risk of not growing when we have the opportunity to help more people. Clara met his eyes directly. You've spent 5 years proving that your principles work on a small scale. Maybe it's time to test whether they work on a larger one. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the front door. Through the glass, Clara could see a figure in an expensive overcoat, hands cupped around his face to peer inside. Thomas frowned. They'd clearly posted their closing hours, and it was well past midnight. Probably someone who heard about the competition, he said, moving toward the door. I'll explain that we're closed. But when Thomas opened the door, the man who entered wasn't a curious customer. He was tall, well-dressed, and bore a striking resemblance to Thomas, the same green eyes, the same strong jawline, but with an air of authority that suggested he was accustomed to having his presence command immediate attention. Hello, Thomas, the man said, quite an impressive showing today. I'm proud of you. Thomas went rigid, his hand still gripping the door handle. Father, what are you doing here? I came to see my son win a baking competition. Is that so strange? Thomas Brennan Jr. stepped fully into the restaurant, his gaze taking in every detail with the calculating attention of someone who evaluated businesses for a living. Though I must say, this establishment is smaller than I expected. It serves our needs, Thomas replied stiffly. I'm sure it does. And this must be your partner, Miss Mitchell. The elder Brennan turned to Clara with practiced charm. I've heard interesting things about your family's textile business. Tragic how that ended. Clara felt ice form in her chest. You knew my father? Edgar was a respected competitor before his unfortunate difficulties. Brennan Industries occasionally purchased fabrics for our office facilities and employee uniforms. Thomas Jr.'s expression remained carefully neutral. I was sorry to hear about the fire and its aftermath. Were you? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Sorry enough to help when he was fighting the insurance company. Sorry enough to offer him work when he lost everything. Business is business, Miss Mishville. Personal sympathy doesn't override market realities. The casual dismissal sparked something dangerous in Clara's chest. Market realities like taking advantage of a man's desperation to acquire his customer lists at bargain prices. Thomas Jr.'s expression sharpened. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that Brennan Industries moved remarkably quickly to capture my father's contracts after the fire, almost as if they'd been prepared for the opportunity. Clara, Thomas warned quietly, but she was beyond caution now. Tell me, Mr. Brennan, did your company happen to have any connection to the insurance investigation that found my father negligent? Any financial relationships with the investigators who denied our claims? The silence that followed was electric. Thomas Jr.'s mask of polite interest had slipped, revealing something much colder underneath. You're making serious accusations without evidence. I'm asking serious questions that deserve honest answers. The business world is complex, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes companies benefit from their competitors' misfortunes without having caused them. And sometimes they cause them deliberately. Thomas stepped between Clara and his father, his own face pale with growing understanding. Is she right? Did Brennan Industries have a hand in destroying the Mitchell textile business? I came here to congratulate you on your success, not to be interrogated about ancient business dealings. That's not an answer. Thomas Jr. studied his son's face carefully. You've changed, Thomas. When you left Chicago, you were idealistic but naive. I see that working with Miss Mitchell has sharpened your edge considerably. Clara has taught me to recognize moral courage when I see it. Something I apparently didn't learn growing up. Moral courage? Thomas Jr. laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean the courage to throw away inherited advantages and scrape by as a small-town baker? To partner with someone whose family was too weak to survive in competitive markets? I mean the courage to build something honest instead of inheriting something corrupt. Thomas's voice had grown dangerously quiet. Did you orchestrate the destruction of the Mitchell textile business? For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Then Thomas Jr. smiled a cold expression that held no warmth whatsoever. Your father was an excellent businessman, Miss Mitchell, but he operated by outdated rules in a modern market. He refused several generous bout offers, insisted on maintaining expensive safety standards that reduced profitability, and treated his workers like family instead of resources. Such approaches are admirable but ultimately unsustainable. That's still not an answer, Clara said. The fire was genuinely accidental, an overheated electrical system in an aging building. But the insurance investigation? Well, insurance companies respond favorably to expert testimony about industrial safety standards. And expert witnesses can be expensive to retain unless one has appropriate business relationships. Clara felt the world tilt slightly. Her father had been destroyed not by random misfortune, but by calculated manipulation, a conspiracy that had used his own integrity against him. You bastard, Thomas said quietly. You destroyed an honest man and his family to steal his customers. I protected Brennan Industries' interests and those of our employees. Your father's principles were admirable but impractical. He would have failed eventually anyway. We simply accelerated the inevitable while minimizing broader economic disruption. And the 300 people who lost their jobs when his mill closed found employment elsewhere, I'm sure. The market adjusts to changing conditions. Clara found her voice at last. The market doesn't adjust. People like you manipulate it to serve your purposes, regardless of who gets destroyed in the process. Welcome to reality, Miss Mitchell. The strong survive, the weak perish, and sentiment is a luxury only successful people can afford. Thomas Jr. turned back to his son. Which brings me to why I'm really here. Let me guess, Thomas said. You want me to come home, rejoin the family business, apply my newfound maturity to help Brennan Industries achieve even greater success. Something like that. Your little experiment in manual labor has been educational, but you've proven your point. It's time to resume your proper role in the family enterprise. And if I refuse, then you'll continue living on your trust fund allowance while pretending to be a common laborer. But you'll never build anything significant without family resources, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you chose sentiment over substantive achievement. Thomas Jr. pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. This contains formal documentation transferring significant business holdings to your direct control. Rail lines, manufacturing facilities, commercial properties, assets worth more than this entire town. Accept your inheritance, and you'll have the resources to build whatever kind of enterprise you envision. Clara watched Thomas stare at the envelope, understanding that this moment would define the rest of his life. Accept his father's offer, and he'd have unlimited resources to achieve any goal he set. Refuse it, and he'd remain dependent on his own limited earnings and the modest trust fund he'd barely touched. "There's one condition," Thomas Jr. continued. "Miss Mitchell cannot be part of any business arrangement funded by Brennan Industries resources. Her family's legacy makes such a partnership inappropriate." The choice was stark and deliberate: wealth and power, or Clara and the principles they built together. Thomas Jr. had crafted his offer to force his son to choose between idealism and practical achievement, between love and legacy. Thomas took the envelope and held it for a long moment, feeling its weight. Then, without breaking eye contact with his father, he walked to the stove and dropped it into the fire. "There's your answer," he said as the papers caught flame. "I choose Clara. I choose honesty. One choose building something real instead of inheriting something corrupt." Thomas Jr. watched his offer burn with no visible emotion. "You're making a mistake that will cost you everything you could have achieved. I'm making the only choice that will let me sleep at night. Principles don't pay bills, Thomas. And they don't change the fundamental realities of how business actually works. Maybe not, but they're the only foundation worth building on." After Thomas Jr. departed, Clara and Thomas stood together in their small restaurant, processing what had just occurred. They had definitively severed ties with corrupt wealth and chosen to build their future on their own terms. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "Do you regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Burning the money?" "No, learning the truth about your family?" "No." Thomas took her hands in his. "The only thing I regret is that my family's greed destroyed yours. That wasn't your fault. You chose differently." "I chose you," Thomas said simply. "And I choose us, whatever that means for our future." As they turned off the restaurant lights and climbed the stairs to their separate rooms, both understood that their victory at the festival had been only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the ongoing work of building something worthy of the principles they'd chosen to defend. But tonight, they had each other, they had their integrity, and they had the knowledge that sometimes choosing love over money and principles over profit could actually win. 6 months after the Harvest Festival, Brennan's restaurant had transformed into something neither Clara nor Thomas could have imagined during those desperate early days. The regional competition had brought them 3 first-place ribbons and a cookbook contract that was already generating advance orders from specialty stores across the Midwest. Dr. Morrison's pharmaceutical partnership had established a thriving medicinal preparation business in the back rooms, serving customers from 5 counties who traveled specifically for Thomas's precisely formulated herbal remedies. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the expanded kitchen facilities or the steady stream of customers. It was the way Clara and Thomas moved together through their shared work, their partnership having evolved into something deeper and more profound than either business collaboration or romantic attachment. They had become essential to each other in ways that transcended any single category of human relationship. This particular spring morning found Clara arranging the daily bread display while Thomas worked on a special commission, a wedding cake, for the daughter of their former competitor, Robert Miller. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Miller had specifically requested their services after his own attempts at formal pastry work had proven inadequate for such an important occasion. "The buttercream roses need another hour to set properly," Thomas reported, stepping back to evaluate his progress. "But the flavor balance is exactly what Mrs. Miller requested: lemon cake with raspberry filling and vanilla, Swiss meringue buttercream." Clara admired the elegant creation taking shape under his skilled hands. "She be beautiful. Though I still think it's remarkable that Miller swallowed his pride enough to ask for our help. Desperation makes us all. His daughter's happiness matters more than his ego." Thomas wiped his hands on his apron. "Besides, good business means serving everyone well, regardless of past competition." The front door chimed, announcing the arrival of their morning customers. Clara had learned to recognize the subtle differences in how people entered, the confident stride of regular customers, the hesitant steps of first-time visitors, the purposeful march of those with specific business to conduct. This footfall belonged to the confident category, but with an underlying urgency that suggested important news. Jake Morrison burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and the spring air. "Clara, Thomas, you need to see this immediately." He thrust a newspaper into Clara's hands, not the local Millbrook Gazette, but the Chicago Tribune, its headlines bold and dramatic. Clara's eyes widened as she read the front-page story that had captured Jake's attention. Industrial corruption exposed. Federal investigation reveals systematic insurance fraud conspiracy. The article detailed a sweeping investigation into business practices that had destroyed dozens of smaller companies across the Midwest. Brennan Industries featured prominently, with specific mention of orchestrated insurance investigations designed to eliminate competition and acquire valuable business assets at below-market prices. Thomas's father was named as a primary subject of the federal inquiry. "They got him," Clara whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the implications. All of them. The insurance investigators, the corrupt officials, the companies that benefited from destroyed businesses. Thomas read over her shoulder, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "Federal prosecutors are seeking criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. They're talking about prison sentences, not just fines." "There's more," Jake said, pointing to a sidebar article. "Look at the section about victims' compensation." Clara found the relevant text, her heart racing as she read about a federal fund being established to compensate families and businesses destroyed by the conspiracy. The amounts mentioned weren't complete restitution, but they represented acknowledgement of the injustices that had been perpetrated and practical assistance for rebuilding shattered lives. "Miss Mitchell," called a voice from the doorway. They turned to see a man in a formal suit, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested official business. "I'm Assistant Federal Attorney Richard Hayes. I've been looking for you." Clara's stomach dropped. After all they'd built, after all the progress they'd made, was she somehow going to be dragged into the legal consequences of her father's destruction? "What can I do for you, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You can accept my apologies on behalf of the federal government for the injustices your family suffered. And you can review these documents regarding compensation for the destruction of Mitchell Textiles." He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Based on our investigation, we've determined that your father's business was deliberately targeted and systematically destroyed through fraudulent insurance practices. The compensation calculation is based on the mill's estimated value at the time of destruction, plus projected earnings for the 5 years following the fire." Clara stared at the papers, afraid to hope that this might represent more than token acknowledgement. How much compensation? $47,000 to be paid immediately upon your acceptance of the settlement terms. Additionally, if you choose to rebuild Mitchell Textiles, the federal government will provide loan guarantees and preferential contract opportunities to help re-establish your family's business. The amount was staggering more money than Clara had handled since her family's downfall, enough to restart her father's business or pursue any other opportunity she could imagine. It represented not just financial restitution, but official vindication of everything her family had stood for. "There's no requirement that you accept this settlement," Attorney Hayes continued. "You could pursue individual litigation for potentially larger amounts. But the federal prosecutors believe this offer represents fair compensation, while allowing you to move forward without years of court proceedings." Clara looked at Thomas, seeing her own amazement reflected in his expression. "Could I have some time to consider this?" "Of course. Though I should mention that there's significant media interest in this case." Several victims have already agreed to interviews with national newspapers. Your story, successful baker's daughter overcomes family tragedy through honest work, would be particularly compelling for public understanding of what these conspiracies actually cost in human terms. After attorney Hayes departed, Clara and Thomas found themselves alone with possibilities they'd never dared to imagine. The compensation money could fund any expansion they envisioned: regional restaurant locations, cookbook publishing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, or even the complete rebuilding of Mitchell Textiles as a model for ethical business practices. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked gently. "I'm thinking about my father," Clara replied. "He believed that honest business practices would ultimately triumph over corruption. He died believing he'd been proven wrong. And now we have the chance to prove he was right. The question is how to use this opportunity to honor his memory while building something meaningful for our own future." Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the bustling main street of Millbrook. $47,000 could transform this entire community. We could establish the kind of businesses that provide good jobs, support local suppliers, and serve as examples of what ethical entrepreneurship looks like. We could also use it to expand beyond Millbrook, take our approaches to larger markets, reach more people, create a model that others could replicate. Clara joined him at the window. The regional competition showed us that our techniques work in bigger venues. This money could fund the kind of expansion that spreads our philosophy as widely as possible. Or we could rebuild Mitchell Textiles, restore your family's name, and create jobs in an industry that desperately needs ethical leadership. They were interrupted by Dr. Morrison's arrival, his medical bag replaced by a folder containing architectural drawings and business plans. "Perfect timing," he said, surveying their serious expressions. "I've got the preliminary designs for our pharmaceutical expansion, but I can come back if you're in the middle of something important." "Actually, your timing couldn't be better," Clara said. "We've just received an opportunity that could fund everything we've discussed and more." She explained the compensation offer and the federal investigation's revelations. Dr. Morrison listened with growing excitement, immediately grasping the implications for their shared ambitions. "This changes everything," he said. "With that kind of capital, we could establish a full pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. Not just medicinal preparations for local customers, but research and development of new compounds. We could become a regional center for medical innovation. Or we could use the money to establish multiple restaurant locations," Thomas pointed out. "Create a network of establishments that all operate according to our principles of quality, community service, and fair employment practices." "Why choose just one?" Clara asked suddenly. $47,000 is substantial, but it's not unlimited. However, it could serve as seed capital for multiple ventures that support and complement each other. She moved to the blackboard they'd installed for daily specials and began sketching an interconnected business model. Restaurant locations in 3 or 4 regional cities, each incorporating pharmaceutical preparation facilities supervised by licensed physicians. A central commercial bakery supplying specialty products to retail customers. A rebuilt Mitchell Textiles focused on organic and sustainable fabric production for health-conscious consumers. Thomas studied her diagram with growing enthusiasm. Each business supports the others. The restaurants provide market testing for new products. The pharmaceutical operations add value and credibility. The textile business supplies materials for restaurant linens and pharmaceutical packaging. And all of them operate according to the same principles, Dr. Morrison added. Fair wages, community support, environmental responsibility, and absolute commitment to quality over profit maximization. "It's ambitious," Clara admitted. "Probably more ambitious than 3 people should attempt. But it's also exactly the kind of comprehensive approach that could demonstrate that ethical business practices aren't just morally superior, they're economically sustainable and competitively successful. The discussion continued through the morning and into the afternoon, with each participant contributing expertise and ideas that refined and strengthened their emerging vision. By evening, they had outlined a 5-year expansion plan that would establish them as leaders in multiple industries while maintaining the community focus that had made their initial success meaningful. As the sun set over Millbrook, Clara found herself alone with Thomas in the restaurant kitchen where their partnership had begun. The space felt different now, not smaller, but somehow more significant, as if it had become the foundation for something much larger than either of them had originally envisioned. "Are you overwhelmed?" Thomas asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "I'm grateful," Clara replied. 6 months ago, I was stealing food because I had no other choice. Tonight, we're planning business ventures that could affect thousands of lives. The transformation seems almost impossible to believe. "The transformation isn't in our circumstances," Thomas said quietly. "It's in us. You've become someone who sees opportunities instead of obstacles, who builds instead of just surviving. I've learned to take risks for principles instead of playing. It's safe out of fear." Clara turned to face him fully. "And we've learned to trust each other completely. That might be the most remarkable change of all." Thomas stepped closer, his expression growing serious. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said weeks ago." "What is it?" "I love you. Not just as a partner, not just as a friend, but as the person I want to spend the rest of my life building dreams with. I've loved you since the night you stood up to Mrs. Hartwell, but I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stole that pie with such determined dignity." Clara felt her heart racing, not with surprise but with the relief of finally hearing spoken what she'd hoped for, but hadn't dared to assume. "I love you too. I think I have since you offered me a job instead of calling the police. But I know I have since you chose to burn your inheritance rather than abandon our partnership." "Then marry me," Thomas said simply. "Be my partner in everything. Business, life, dreams, challenges, whatever comes next. Help me build something worthy of the love we found together." "Yes," Clara whispered, then louder. "Yes, absolutely yes." As they kissed in the warm kitchen light, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that had brought them together, Clara reflected on the impossible journey that had led to this moment. She'd stolen a pie in desperation and discovered a love that fed her soul. She'd lost everything she'd thought she wanted and found everything she'd actually needed. The federal compensation would fund their ambitious expansion plans. The business opportunities would provide security and purpose for years to come. But the real treasure wasn't money or professional success. It was the partnership they'd forged. Through shared values, complementary strengths, and absolute trust in each other's integrity. 1 year later, Clara Mitchell Brennan stood in the largest of their 3 restaurant locations, watching her husband put finishing touches on a wedding cake that would serve 200 guests. Mitchell Brennan Enterprises now employed 47 people across their various operations, all earning wages that reflected their value rather than market minimums. Their cookbook had become a bestseller. Their pharmaceutical preparations were sought after by physicians throughout the region, and their rebuilt textile operation was pioneering sustainable production methods that other manufacturers were beginning to emulate. But the most satisfying measure of their success wasn't financial. It was the way their employees spoke about their work with pride, the way their customers became advocates for their approach, and the way other businesses had begun adopting similar practices after seeing their success. Clara had learned that real love, wasn't just about romantic feelings between 2 people. It was about caring enough to do right by everyone whose lives you touched. Thomas had taught her that through his daily example, and together they'd built an enterprise that fed souls as well as bodies, that nourished communities as well as individuals. the woman who'd once stolen a pie in desperation had become someone who fed hope to anyone hungry for the possibility that honest work and genuine love could triumph over corruption and despair. And every morning, as she and Thomas began their work together, Clara remembered that sometimes the most desperate moments of our lives are actually the beginning of our greatest transformations. Love, as it turned out, was indeed the secret ingredient that made everything else possible. And it would continue feeding their souls and the souls of everyone they touched for the rest of time. The ripple effects of their success extended far beyond what Clara and Thomas had initially imagined. The federal investigation had sparked a nationwide examination of corporate practices, leading to new legislation protecting small businesses from predatory acquisition tactics. Clara found herself testifying before Congress about the human cost of industrial corruption, her story becoming a symbol of resilience that inspired regulatory reform. Their business model attracted attention from universities studying sustainable entrepreneurship. Harvard Business School invited Thomas to guest lecture on ethical scaling, how values-driven growth creates competitive edge. Clara was asked to address the National Women's Business Association about From Survival to Success, building partnerships that transform communities. The Mitchell-Brennan Foundation, established with a portion of their profits, began awarding grants to other entrepreneurs who demonstrated commitment to ethical business practices. Each year, they selected 10 small businesses to receive funding, mentorship, and access to their network of suppliers and customers. The foundation's motto, carved into the stone entrance of their headquarters, read, "Feeding dreams, nourishing communities." Dr. Morrison's pharmaceutical division had grown into a research center that attracted scientists from across the country. Their breakthrough in developing affordable alternatives to expensive medications earned recognition from the American Medical Association and contracts with rural hospitals throughout the Midwest. The facility now employed 15 researchers and had filed patents on 7 innovative compounds. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Clara and Thomas stood together in the original Brennan's restaurant, now preserved as a historical landmark and training center for their expanding enterprise. The small kitchen where Clara had first learned to knead dough properly had been converted into a museum display, complete with the original mixing bowls and the very oven where their first competition entries had baked. Do you ever miss the simplicity of those early days? Clara asked, watching new employees practice basic bread techniques under the guidance of their master bakers. I miss the certainty, Thomas replied thoughtfully. When our biggest decision was whether to enter the cornbread competition. But I don't miss the limitation. We're feeding thousands of people now instead of dozens, training hundreds of workers in skills that will serve them for life, creating opportunities that didn't exist before we started. Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their success had brought complexity, multiple locations to manage, hundreds of employees to support, regulatory requirements to navigate, and constant pressure to maintain quality while scaling operations. But it had also brought the deep satisfaction of knowing their work created meaningful opportunities for others. The original pie display case still held a place of honor in the restaurant, though now it showcased not just Thomas's creations, but the work of apprentices who had learned their craft in his kitchen. Each pie bore a small card identifying its baker and the techniques used, a way of sharing knowledge and recognizing individual achievement within their collective success. Mrs. Hartwell, ironically, had become one of their most reliable customers. After her own financial circumstances changed following her husband's involvement in a separate corruption scandal, she now worked part-time in their front office, her social skills repurposed for customer relations and event planning. The transformation had been humbling for everyone involved, demonstrating that people could change when circumstances demanded. It Miller's daughter, whose wedding cake had marked one of their early collaborative successes, now managed their largest restaurant location. Her natural leadership abilities and deep understanding of their operational Philosophy had made her invaluable to their expansion efforts. It was proof that talent could emerge from unexpected sources when given proper opportunity and support. As the sun set over Millbrook on that anniversary evening, Clara and Thomas walked hand in hand through the town square where a bronze plaque commemorated the harvest festival that had launched their regional success. Children played around the statue of the town founder while their parents shopped at businesses that now thrive thanks to the economic activity generated by Mitchell Brennan Enterprises. "We did something good here," Clara said quietly. "We did. Something necessary," Thomas corrected. "We proved that business can be a force for community building instead of community exploitation. That success doesn't require abandoning principles." Their story had become legend in Millbrook and inspiration throughout the region. But for Clara and Thomas, it remained simply the foundation for each day's work, the ongoing effort to build something worthy of the love that had brought them together and the trust that others placed in their leadership. The woman who had once stolen a pie in desperation had become someone who ensured that no one in their community ever faced such desperate choices. The man who had walked away from inherited wealth had created honest wealth that lifted everyone around him. Together, they had transformed not just their own lives, but the very definition of what business success could mean. And in their kitchen each morning, as they prepared for another day of feeding bodies and souls, Clara and Thomas were reminded that love expressed through daily actions, sustained commitments, and the courage to choose principle over profit remained the most powerful force in any recipe for a meaningful life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.